Okay, everybody. Good morning. This is very exciting. I didn't hear all of the initial talk this morning, but the tail end of it sounded really fantastic. And it is really just want to take a moment to, well, let me introduce myself. My name is Nancy Meyer. I work with an organization called Community Forklift in the Port Towns area of Prince George's County, which is just a couple miles from here. We're going to be talking this morning about a project in this area called the Port Towns. The Port Towns are 4 municipalities: Waynesburg, Manor, Cottage City, and Edmonston. Like I said, just a couple miles from campus. So this is a really close environmental, we're dealing with environmental issues very close to campus, very relevant even for students and faculty and staff who work at the University of Maryland. But I just want to take 1 second and, having looked over the agenda, and thank Dr. Wilson and his students and the staff of the university for this fantastic program. I've had an affiliation with the university as a student, graduate student, and a staff person for many years, and it is fantastic to see this kind of activity happening here on campus. So, and it's, this person here, Dr. Wilson, just does, and I don't often have a chance to say anything about him, but he's just amazing and has done this amazing work to bring people together. So anyway, thank you. So let me put my glasses on. So we're going to try to do this in a little bit more of a participatory way. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview and introduction to what we've been doing in this neighborhood level organizing. And then I will try not to take too much time with that, but we will then get into some questions for our panelists, who will talk a little bit more about some discrete areas that we've been working on. One of those is a struggle against a concrete batching plant just a couple miles from here. Talking about, Dr. Wilson will be talking about our move to use citizen scientists to do research. And Paul and Chris will talk about the struggle, but also some about some of the community elements. What is the context in which this work is happening? Okay, so there is an incredible sort of confluence and concurrent activities and organizations and things happening probably over the last 15 years in this neighborhood. It's kind of complicated, so please bear with me. I'm trying to set a context for you all to understand, and it may not all hang together, but as soon as we get to more questions, you'll be able to slot in some of these ideas. So the community, as I said, is just here in Prince George's County, called the Port, P-O-R-T, Port Towns, because these were towns that were greatly influenced by the Anacostia River. I tell the story about that. At one point, my partner used to say, "Why do you keep calling them the poor towns?" And I said, "No, it's not the poor towns, it's the port towns." But people didn't even conceive that these towns were connected to actually, commerce and activity on the Anacostia River. So the 4 towns are actually separate municipalities. Prince George's County has 27 or 8 municipalities within its government structure, and that's a really important thing to understand. There's unincorporated areas and incorporated areas. And the political makeup of these areas and understanding that is so important for organizing. If you don't understand where different areas of power and interest lie, you have no ability to make change. So it's really important to understand those things and how they work. The municipalities call themselves the port towns, and that port towns is a particular area, but it is not an area that has any formal power. There's no formal power called the port towns. It's only the towns themselves or the county government that have any state level, meaning the ability to tax state level functions and activities. Okay, so we're dealing with a low to moderate income community, primarily persons of color, and we'll get to some details on that soon. Another important element is that it's a mixed use area. It's heavy industrial, it's light industrial, commercial, and residential, which means that everything's kind of mixed up together the way the development has happened, and there's reasons and interests about how things have developed that way. There's also, and this is not actually in the EJ report, there is a Superfund site and a very large brownfield site. So you have a 12-acre brownfield site just a couple miles from university campus. Okay, so there's been a long-standing history of citizen engagement to address various problems and issues. They have primarily been really kind of standard issue community engagement issues, civil issues, schools, road issues, facade and commercial development issues, those kinds of things. they haven't been particularly politicized issues. They've been, and I would say rather depoliticized issues. They're just sort of run-of-the-mill, we have problems, we're going to try to fix those problems without an overarching understanding of the political landscape and the dynamics of power in communities. So there hasn't been a focus on justice or rights really in this particular community, but long-standing engagements. Another really important element with this community is that community stands at this very funny nexus of development in College Park, University of Maryland, which all you know have bought up huge tracts of land going up and down Route 1, working with developers. This looks, I've been here in this area for 30 years. It's only in the last 10 years that this entire landscape of this commercial and university area has changed significantly. It's really affected the communities around it. And DC is changing, has changed vastly in the last 10 to 15 years. The gentrification has just been unbelievable. People are being pushed out. There's very little affordable housing in DC. So where's all that going? Who's being pushed out? Where are they going? Okay, so College Park is developing. DC is developing, so it's coming like this. Oh, where's that spot right here? Probably like the Peace Cross in Bladensburg. If you all don't know where the Peace Cross is, it'd be a good place to sort of find out what's happening in just like a mile or two radius of this university. That is sort of the center of the port towns right there. And we've talked a lot about what's going to happen. It's going to go one or two ways. The bad stuff is going to get pushed out into these neighborhoods, or the community has to get on that saddle and decide we're going to take charge of what's happening here in some kind of way. And that's what we're trying to do. Okay, so we have accelerating development. We also have, interesting, because there's always this sort of discussion about how low-income people and people of color don't have interest in the environment. Well, that's just some bizarre ideology. It's just completely not true. And this community has a long-standing interest, partly because we're in this wonderful place on the river. There's a huge park that flows through the port towns. If you all never have been out there to the Waynesburg Waterfront Park, it's a fabulous resource. It's home to most of the rowing schools in DC, and it's amazing to see this. And they're all on the river rowing. So it's a big park there that was built with citizen engagement that got that park done. Recently, the park walkway pathway has been connected to the paths in DC. So you can actually ride your bike all the way from Maryland here, all the way into the city on these bike paths. So it's a pretty fabulous resource. So there's been a history of sort of consciousness about these issues. And so I'd say 15 or 20 years ago, there began to be a nexus of things coming together. The Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which is a DC-based organization interested in waste and resource recovery, partnered with the Port Towns Community Development Corporation. And both Chris and Paul and myself both work with that organization. So they came out and said, you know, you need to bring a resource recovery operation out here. And an organization that actually I run called Community Forklift was located in the port towns. That operation became somewhat of a nexus for a lot of environmental activity in the port towns. Additionally, other organizations started to feel like, oh, this is a good place for us to be too, because we have potentially other partner agencies and organizations that would support our work. In 2010, EcoCity Farms was initiated and developed in the port towns. They opened a farm very close to Community Forklift and opened a second site 3 years later in Bladensburg. So one's in Edmondson, one's in Bladensburg. Community gardens, a number of the Green Street. There's a Green Street. One of the first Green Streets in the country was in Edmondson, Maryland. And actually, Adam Ortiz, who was the mayor of Edmonston, is now director of the Department of Environment for the county. So there was environmental consciousness that was really growing and beginning to coalesce in that community. Additionally, a number of other community organizations were growing and strengthening at that time as well. Chris was involved in a number of them. There's a group looking at accountability issues for the town of Bladensburg, the CACB. There's the B5, Building a Better Bladensburg, block by block and business by business. A number of community activists were involved in those organizations. Green teams, and the state also, we're setting up programs, sustainability programs and incentive grant programs. So there was a lot of coalescing of energies moving forward to create a lot of energy around citizen activism. In 2014, myself and a couple other people went to a project out in Oregon called the Eco District Project, and it's a nonprofit that has a model for doing sustainable community development that they bring mostly cities or sections of cities. Prince George's County was the first time a county actually participated in this project, and we went out there and talked about how we could do this kind of development in the port towns. Meanwhile, the Port Towns Community Development Corporation was really doing a lot of grassroots organizing to figure out how to really have that be more of a ground-up project and not just a top-down project. But we've seen in our community these sort of different polarities sort of coming together. One was this up and down, the county officials interested in making this happen, citizens interested from the bottom up, and the same thing with looking at problems, identifying problems at the same time that we're also looking for solutions. And the Eco District project and model was a vehicle for solutions, creating community-based, neighborhood-based sustainability, and not just typical kinds of community-based revitalization and development. So soon after, in that period, around 2014 and 15, and Chris especially, through the CDC and the B5, was doing a lot of work looking at zoning applications. And there were several applications that came through that she became sort of our sort of self-taught attorney, learning about all these issues. And she was actually, because of a lot of the work she did, we were able to sort of successfully have several applications that, for businesses we didn't want to see in our community, basically fail, which was great. That was a win for us. Then in 2016, an application was put in for a concrete batching plant right across the street from the waterfront park. And that really galvanized a lot of folks in our community, including the three of us and Dr. Wilson. So that galvanizing of that caused us to do a lot of extra work, stay up a lot of late nights. And we're in the middle of that struggle right now, which Chris and Paul will tell you more about. But so there's been this sort of really interesting long history of all these different elements in this community beginning to coalesce and build steam. And I would say for probably about 2012 to 2014, really started gathering a lot of momentum till today, where these organizations, several of the environmental organizations that I mentioned, are doing extremely well, have been vehicles for community economic development, job training, job growth in our community, and serve as really a national model for how sustainable development and developing economic resources can happen at the community-based level, while also fostering community engagement and serious activism to make change to address the kind of cumulative environmental burdens that Dr. Wilson often talks about, as well as something aspirational. What do we really want in our communities? And why can't we dream and decide that we decide how to have sustainable communities, and not our county government, and not investors, and not developers, and not banks, and not CVS, and every chain thing that comes along, but the community. So that's our start. Paul, would you give us a little bit of rundown on some of the demographics?
Sure. So my name is Paul Howe. I live in Colmar Manor. I'm a special education teacher at DC. And just put a really quick demographic and governance rundown of 4 municipalities: Colmar Manor, Bladensburg, Cottage City, and Edmonston. As Nancy said, they all kind of border the headwaters of the Anacostia River. And so one of the key things is there's been a big increase in the Hispanic and Latino percentage of the population in all towns since 2000. For example, in Colmar Manor in 2000, about 18% identified as Hispanic. As of 2016, it was about 55%. That's not quite as extreme in the other towns, but it's the same trend in all the towns. At the same time, the percentage of African Americans in each town has been decreasing. So in Colmar Manor, it was about 50% in 2000, and 2016, about 27%. So we're seeing a demographic change in that way. Language as well, and citizenship. So in Colmar Manor, about 62% of the residents speak a non-English language, and about 67% of the whole town are U.S. citizens. So that range, in Cottage City, it's a little bit higher for the U.S. citizens, and a little bit lower, the percentage of people that speak a non-English language. But it's kind of the same general trend in 4 towns. Bladesburg's very interesting. It's an outlier in terms of population and size. It's about, although it's still fairly small, it's about 1 square mile in size. Cottage City is only about 1/4 of a square mile. So some of these are very small places, which it has interesting impacts on the activism, which I'm sure we'll get into later. Waynesburg, being larger, has about 70% of the 4 towns residents. The 4 towns altogether have about 14,000 people in them. The interesting thing I came up with is how, the average income and the poverty rate. So the U.S. median household income is about $59,000. In Bladesburg, it's about $44,000 for a household. And 20.1% of the people are considered to be impoverished. The national average is about 14, so they exceed that. Colmar Manor, Cottage City, Evanston all have about median income, household incomes about in the 50s, and the poverty rate ranges from about 9 to 14%. So that's a really quick overview of kind of where these towns are going demographically right now.
Okay, great. I'll stop here for a second and give opportunity. Any questions, thoughts so far?
And I know some of you probably have a deeper view than us, given, and so if anything like that comes up, please share it, because we're here to listen and learn as well as markets.
Yeah.
In terms of the shift for African Americans, where are they going, and then why the change? Is it economic, gentrification, having another firm?
That's a really good question to explore. I think people are being displaced from DC, and they're looking for places that are close to DC that are still relatively affordable. Although, as Nancy mentioned, we fear that might be changing, particularly in some of the towns. Cottage City, apparently, their average housing prices are going way up, and so that's something that we're looking at. Like, where do people go if they can't afford to live here anymore? Do they go a little further out, like the East Riverdale, or what? So that would be something for us to look at.
Yeah, and like Paul said, I think what's starting is biting around the edges is the gentrification that's coming from College Park and has gone down Route 1, to University Park, Hyattsville, Riverdale. The developments that are happening down there, they're starting to chew away. We're beginning to see the edges of ours, even where there's nice historic homes, being the prices somewhat going up. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting to look at it from a view of gentrification, but I was hoping that today maybe something will come up around flight away from the immigrant communities and whether you see that as being an issue that's happening. So it's no longer the Great White Flight, it's flight away from immigrant communities, whether that is people of color or... I don't have an answer.
Yeah.
But I work in Prince George's County quite a bit, and I think it's something that needs to be talked about. So I'd be interested in hearing.
Yeah, there's a lot of different population groups occupying really close spaces to each other in these communities, of which there's not always good relationships. It's not just a simple black and white relationship, but there really is tensions between a lot of the different communities. There's also religious tensions. So, and we're really aware of those dynamics. So, and it's complicated.
Right. I think something to consider is that all of the inner beltway communities within Prince George's County are seeing a significant increase in population and the lack of affordable housing.
Yep.
And so there are actually many more residents than are actually recorded via census numbers.
Right. Yeah, and by a large amount, we think. In the port towns too, I think the official numbers are what, like 9,600 or something, but we think it could be much as 12 or 13,000.
I just want to comment sort of on that, follow up on that. So I work with about 40-something EJ organizations across the country, and one of the, I have never heard of them talk about flight, I guess, as a racial thing. It's always been gentrification, and I mean that's the 42 organizations that I work with, and that's around the country. And that's been the main issue. And when I always ask, people, where do they go? You know, when you tear down public housing, or you tear down, you know, very low-income housing, nobody knows the answer to that question. So I haven't seen, I live in Prince George's County, and in an area that's very mixed, you know, when it comes to.
Where do you live?
I live in Bowie.
Uh-huh.
We're gonna call it Bowie, Lake Arbor, Mitchellville, or depending on the different name. But it's a mixture of people. And a lot of people came from, you know, from DC. Those who could, I couldn't afford to live in DC, but those who could moved there, but where did the other people go? And so I haven't heard the issue of, I guess, racial flight or whatever you want to call it. So I just make sure that that's, you know, that's in the forefront.
Yeah, just to quickly chime in so we can get to some other points. There is a lecture later on the day on the transportation equity issue session. I think block 3 with Dr. Willow Lund. And so in some of her work, she's looked at there's hyper segregation in Metro DC. We have hyper racial segregation. So there's a lot of segregation of black groups. And so she can talk about the changes in the demographics over the last 20 years. And then the amounts of segregation, the hyper segregation of groups. And you see less white people segregated and also less concentrated poverty too. So there's hyper segregation and concentrated poverty across the region. So you're seeing high concentration poverty of black people segregated, high concentration poverty of Latinx populations segregated across the region, including going to Charles County. So a lot of those people who have been displaced from the county and from DC are going to Charles County and other counties. So that could be questions to ask. As part of that presentation about transportation equity, they're going to talk about the purple line, and so that's some of that discussion what we're having now could be questions to be raised in that session.
I guess another thing for me, because I've been living here since 1984, and know about the Port Town and looking at that if you think about the African Americans and some of the Latinos, what it is because of their jobs, they have to move closer to where the transportation is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so therefore, they don't tell people where they move because of their jobs. And then because of what's been emerging in Prince George's County with a lot of the claiming of the environmental justice group that don't really represent that group, they in a sense are forming their own little coalitions to kind of like influx their ideas. So I think that when one gives credible data, that the credible data goes to the individuals who is presenting it. Because a lot of times you are not in those flows, and the people will not trust you because you really don't speak for them. And then also to look at the history of those particular places and Prince George's County, that as you look at community groups, to have other people to speak for them, they're speaking their own agenda. So there is more to it. And so as the young lady talked about, she represents those people all across. There are many people who represent groups of blackness across the country. And we do talk a lot because in the environmental justice field that started with Martin Luther King and down south, the children are still alive. And we are now older, so we can communicate from a different perspective. And we're very educated, so we know how to not only help academia, but we also know how to help government to do the kind of work that they're supposed to be doing, which is helping communities.
Yeah, I mean, those are some really, and then we'll move on to Chris, and those are a lot of really important points. Even our organization, we don't claim to speak for anyone. The Port Town CDC is a primarily person of color group. But again, the issue of representation, and this is just a little bit of a sidebar, but the issue of who represents who is a really critical question in organizing. Because really, unless it's a democratic organization, no one is represented for real.
Right.
No matter what group you are,
Right.
whatever group
Right.
constituents you come together to be. And it's really important, and there's been some really interesting critical work done on this to say, we're organizers, but we only represent ourselves. We're not representing anybody else in our work. But that question of representation and voice and all that stuff is a really important thing in our work. So thank you for bringing that up. That's really appreciated. So Chris is going to show you some, stop the talking a little bit, show you some pictures. It'll give you a better sense. I mean, for me, it's always a context and a feel for place that's important, especially for you other people who are Prince George's residents or temporary residents. I'll get out of your proverbial hair.
Well, okay, so the Port Towns, a little bit about a little bit about us. So as Paul was saying, Bladensburg is about a square mile, and I would say it's probably like 2 square miles or so with all 4 of the towns. And the nexus here is really the Anacostia River and the historic port of Bladensburg, which has been in existence since at least the 1700s.
Show them where College Park is.
Okay, yeah, and College Park. This is alternate Route 1, which joins Route 1.
Here, there's one.
Yeah.
Right up there.
Yeah.
Probably at the O.
Right.
I did a map quest, and if you drove from this building to right in the center there, it's 4 miles. It's
Okay.
out.
Yeah. So, of the towns, what you're seeing here are the center of the towns, which is the Peace Cross interchange. Washington D.C. is about a mile the border is about a mile this way. So we're very close. And we are close to, like a transportation intersection. This is Annapolis, Bladensburg Road, Annapolis Road, and alternate Route 1 converging here. Because it is a historic area, we have many historic sites that you'll see here in yellow, and I'll be showing you pictures of those. The green markers that you see are schools. The town of Bladensburg has 8 schools in it, and 3 of them are very close to this nexus area. Okay, there are 6,000 children that come to school in Bladensburg from the port towns, which is a very high number of them. We also have in our area here, is the Bladensburg Library, which is one of the most heavily used libraries in the library system. Okay, and people come from as far as Cheverly and Hyattsville to use that library, and it is in the process of being rebuilt in the next year. Okay, so in the center of our beautiful waterfront area, we also have an I-2 and I-1 industrial area, which has historically been there for a very long time. And the red marker that you see there is Ernest Meyer, which is the company that has proposed to build a concrete batching plant, has been in operation since 1926. Okay, and they're manufacturing, they produce concrete block in a block plant that has been operating since the 1950s. Okay. So, okay, this is a view of the Bladensburg Waterfront Park, Visitor Center. You should all go out and take a look at it. As Nancy mentioned, there is a bike trail, and there are approximately 500 people that commute to downtown Washington, D.C. using the bike trail every day. Peace Cross, which is at that nexus intersection. This is the historic George Washington House, otherwise known as the Indian Head Tavern, and the headquarters of the Anacostia Watershed Society. The Market Master House, which was the Port Authority Master House for the historic Port of Bladensburg, is located in this area. The Hilary Mcgruder House, which is another historic home, it is across the street from Ernest Meyer. This is Bostwick House, which is owned by the town of Bladensburg, and it is the first Secretary of the Navy lived in this home. And University of Maryland School of Architecture has a site that they excavate here, as well as work on the restoration. This is St. Paul's Baptist Church. And it is the a very old African-American congregation from the early, actually from the late 1700s, early 1800s. This building was moved to the site where it currently is now in 1818, okay? And the Free Hope Baptist Church congregation was in existence for over 100 years. And it still is an African-American congregation, and it is across the street, or actually surrounded by Ernest Meyer on 47th Street. Here again is the Four Towns and our public library. Waynesburg Elementary School is 2 blocks from the center of town. We have the 2 high schools across the street from Bladensburg Elementary. And this is Ernest Meyer's block plan. And I will stop right there.
Okay, thanks, Chris. All right, so let's see. All right, so I'm going to skip talking about the organizations. Let's just go right to talking about the block plan since we got this up. So let's get a little bit of background on the situation with the block plan.
Yeah, well, we actually, we've been in this process for about 16 months now. We got wind of the application for the special exception to build the batching plan in addition to the block plan. About 16 months ago, we all had our first meeting actually on January 12th, 2017. So we've been at it for a while now. So it really involved like 3 steps. We had to research the application, which was very extensive.
Do you want to say a little bit about what that means? What
Yeah.
is what's the special exception? What's the what's an application for what?
Yeah, so in order to add the batching plant to the site, it didn't fit with the current zoning regulations, so they have to ask for a special exception in order to be able to do that. That triggers a process. Chris, can you talk a little more about the process? You're kind of an expert with the process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, as Paul mentioned, this is the block plant that currently exists, and Ernest Meyer wanted to add an additional factory. So, a special exception is to it's basically a use by right process where if it's allowed in what is in the I2 zone, which is heavy industrial, and it is an allowable use, the company can submit an application to build a concrete batching plant. It's very specific in Prince George's County Code. Okay, and that's a review process after submitting the requirements for a site plan, a stormwater mitigation plan, and various other components. That's reviewed by the MNC PPC planning department. And then at that point, the application, once it goes out of review, it is transferred to the zoning hearing examiner to gather testimony, evidentiary testimony on why this application should be granted. This particular application has variance requests regarding the setback because it's a very dense, small, compact area. The setbacks that are required for a concrete batching plant of 300 feet, that's what we believe, are not met. And in fact, an example of this is the St. Paul's Baptist Church is 35 feet from the special exception, okay, and not 300 feet.
So just to give you all, so there's a piece of property. It's about 4.5 acres or so. It's kind of a long, narrow property that runs next to Kenilworth Avenue, going from Annapolis Road, I guess, north. So it's an unusually shaped property. They also, when Chris says this is the Bland Block production site, they produce concrete block here. So those gray blocks you see, and brick and that kind of thing, masonry production happen there. There's piles and piles and piles of this block. And trucks in and out, because they also have a commercial store in the front. So you get a sense of the lay of the land. There's a public street, the church is on the left, the block plan is sort of on the right and in the back. And it's pretty, so 4.5 acres, that's a pretty large area of space, where they mix the concrete and then they pour it into these forms and they bake them, and that becomes a concrete block, and they take them out and they put them in bundles, basically on pallets in this yard. So they're piled up everywhere. And one of the features of this yard is the dust. We don't know what's in the dust, and we're trying to figure it out from what we read. There's concerns about silica, and Dr. Wilson can talk more about that, but we have real concerns. In the neighborhood around there, where I work is around there, there's extensive dust, and I never realized until we started working on this project that it's very likely that some of that dust is coming from this plant. But the dust and the contaminants, if whatever the materials are in there, are picked up on the tires of trucks and carried through the whole community. It's not just something that stays there. When it rains, it goes into the watershed, it goes into the ground. So on top of that, the request that Paul's talking about is to add another kind of business on top of the existing one to batch concrete. And what that means is that trucks pull in there. These are diesel trucks with contaminants all day long. These big, huge concrete barrel trucks, which are dangerous enough on the roads, and they fill them with concrete. And they mix there, and then they drive out to deliver it to a job site. They dump it, and then they come back in for more. So then that's happening all day long on top of the other production site. So Chris says, I always call it 2 for 1.
Yeah.
It's like they're trying to put 2 production plants for the cost of 1 in our community, right?
Right.
So that's kind of the what that sort of the bigger picture of that is.
Right, and it's a very limited process by code, which does not require testing of the site for soil, ambient air quality at the site itself, or the stormwater runoff coming from the plant. And there are no requirements to improve the block plant that you just saw.
Do you have other pictures?
As you can see, it's in a great state of disrepair.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have other pictures of the?
Right, this is the back of the.
This is how they keep it.
Right, that's known as Moss Run.
That's moss.
And it goes into the Anacostia.
And you can
Right.
see they have just towers of this stuff stacked up.
This is along Upshur Street. This is more than a city block.
You can see
A
the
block.
it's full of. And if you
Right.
see the runoff is full of we don't know what's in
What's
it.
in it. We don't know what's in it.
And the county doesn't require that anybody find out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Other limits of the special exception, again, are no air quality requirement for testing at the site, and also there is no traffic study because attached to it, the town of Waynesburg proposed a new traffic pattern, and that has not been, no traffic study has been done on that.
So you've got 6,000 kids in the center of town, more of this kind of plant, all put in the same space.
Right, there are 3 schools within 2 blocks of this. The library is within 2 blocks of this. And the traffic pattern set up will go directly around the library. Okay, this is a view of the interior of the block plant with the forklifts and the block trucks. Okay, again, this is a more beautiful view of St. Paul's, but this is a more realistic view of St. Paul's.
You can see them.
Okay, and you can see the dust, sediment in the front of the church. The pastor of the church told us in a community meeting that their church, that they shovel the
With a
dust.
snow shovel.
Shovel the dust off of their stairs so that their congregation can use their building on Sunday. And they really can't use their building during the week because of the traffic.
Hold on just a
This
minute.
is how they are boxed in. All of the surrounding properties are owned by Ernest Meyer.
So is this part of Prince George's County?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So my understanding is for whichever proposal that comes up in terms of planning new things and building.
Can you speak up?
Sorry. So my understanding is for Prince George's County, whatever that you're trying to build as a planning proposal, there has to be included within it a health impact assessment, right?
Not for this application.
They're exempted.
Yes.
They're exempted from this application. Special exceptions do not require health impact
So what's the
assessments.
point of having the HIA if you don't require every entity that's doing it defeats the purpose of it?
Right.
So
Not all development applications require health impact assessment.
We run into a lot of interesting process issues that
Yeah,
are involved.
part of this is that we've had to learn what these processes are.
But you see subtly how thing by thing, how it benefits a certain group of people, and through a bureaucratic process, it looks like it's a fair thing, and then you realize it's like anything that takes care of what needs to happen in terms of the socializing of the environmental burdens is going to go on the community. So this was amazing.
Right.
We actually brought it to their hearing we had with the county council, and they had to stop the hearing.
They called a recess when Chris brought that out.
Good.
Yeah, this dust was collected the day before the hearing. It's approximately 3 pounds.
From one step.
Yeah, from one step in front of the church. This is the view from the front of the church. Again, it's 35 feet.
Question?
I might have missed this, but did you talk about the process by which they got the special exception?
They haven't gotten it.
They haven't got it.
They have not got.
So that's when Paul was talking about the application, you put in this thing called an application for special exception, and it's basically a very intensive both political and legal process. So we jumped on that bandwagon, and Dr. Wilson's been helping us through this whole thing, and we politicized this whole process. So far, we actually recently we had a win. It was remanded back. So I don't want to get into all the technical jargon of this, but we had a win. And we have a pro bono attorney, David Blitzer, out of the Eastern Shore in Maryland, and he's been fantastic. So we were really lucky between us and Dr. Wilson and our pro bono attorney. We've been really kicking it.
So we're 16 months in and it hasn't been approved yet.
Yep.
So can you talk about the health issues a little bit?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. So now's a good time. Yeah. So talk about the implications.
Yeah, so thanks for the question about the HIA. So part of
Yeah.
the implication, so one issue is with the current concrete block plant, it's been grandfathered. So they've never done any air quality monitoring. They've never done a site assessment to know what are the lowest contaminants in the soil profile. So remember, 1920s, nothing since the 1920s. So we have no idea what's at the site. So when you start to expand to the block, to the batching facility, what will lead to is you'll disturb that soil, and we have no idea what types of contaminants are already there. And then of course that material will become wind blown, so you have fugitive dust emissions, and that material will have rain events, so you have runoff. Okay, so you have that. Then if you add the concrete, so you have the cumulative impacts of the two facilities. So that concrete dust has silica. Of course, for those of you you know about, potentially have metals in that dust as well, and you're gonna have particulate matter in that dust. You have combustion byproducts like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs. So a lot of these constituent parts of the concrete dust could lead to adverse health effects. With the diesel trucks that come in and the diesel vehicles that operate, of course you have diesel emissions related to the burning of diesel fuel. So you have 40 different contaminants that are known carcinogens. You also have, I think, benzene and some other formaldehyde maybe associated with that as well. So a lot of those contaminants, so you have cancer-causing agents plus contaminants that can cause asthma attacks, heart disease, elevated blood pressure, stroke, etc. So remember, you heard me say earlier, how can you put America first if you don't put your kids first? You got 6,000 kids who go to school in close proximity or live in close proximity to this facility.
Right.
And so the wind blown materials, plus those 40 diesel truck trips extra per day, plus the commuter traffic in the nexus, or I like to call it confluence area,
Yeah.
because you have a lot of confluence of traffic that's going to that neighborhood. So so it's really, the issue is not doing the HIA means you're not capturing any of those baseline environmental impacts, baseline exposure issues, baseline health issues, and the underlying environmental justice issues. Since you have a high number of people of color, over, was it 70%?
Yeah.
Over 70%. and your poverty rate is over, you said
21.
21%. 21%.
Right.
And plus you have other uses in that area that contribute to environmental degradation and also health concerns in the community.
Right, there's a school bus yard of 100 school buses that parks across the street from the back of Ernest Meyer, and Bates Trucking, trash company, also has a huge vehicle lot there as well.
And
Yeah.
one more quick, and because this facility is designated as a minor source, based on the state's general statute, it's not required to get an air quality permit. So they have not been required to get air quality monitoring. So as part of our discussion or our debate with the lawyers, they said, well, by the state's law,
Yeah.
we are not required to do any of this, and we think we're going to be a load generator. How can you call yourself a load generator if you have no data? So this whole process of then going to the special exception has not been data driven. There's been no data. The
Right.
staff report, they had no health data, they had no exposure data, they had no pollution data. Okay, so a lot of assumptions have been made, and the staff report was biased for the industry. Okay, so there's a lot of procedural issues, and also at the state level, when it comes to these type of sources, we don't have the law is not there to provide the baseline protections to communities. So basically, based on our state statute, there's a gap for minor sources. So you can have a whole lot of minor sources that can impact air quality and human health and not be required to do any air quality monitoring, not be required to have a permit. And that's why facilities like this have gotten away with it. And other facilities in the county, that's a pattern to this in our county. Okay, so I just wanted to say that.
Right, so the other thing, and then we'll just open it up for questions and comments. There's the towns, the town that it's actually going to be in has supported it, generally speaking. So there's a question about, and this is my friend Elizabeth had brought up this issue, it's like the ideology of like people accept these things and think it's okay, and there's a lot of rationale for doing this that creates jobs and all this kind of stuff. And so what Dr. Wilson was saying about but it's not it's not even data driven. It does seem to be interest driven. But there's definitely a set of players in what's happening with this that just are go along and get along. Any development is good development. There's not a critical mindset of the impact on communities. And even as Dr. Will said, we don't even know what the real job production is, what kind of jobs and what the pay, all these factors. And is that worth the health of the entire community? What's the impact on the entire community for 15 jobs? So those costs and benefits are not weighed out in any real empirical way, not even in a basic way. It's just a lot of, we think this is better than nothing kind of mentality. And so we're dealing with that as well, and it's been very tricky in our community because a number of us play a lot of different roles in our community, and yet we're really aware that bringing up the consciousness and understanding the power and interests are just critical to making the kind of changes that we need to see, because if you feel like you can affect that, you can make other things happen as well. So anyway, just end our presentation and open up. So questions
Questions
comments?
from the audience.
Thank you, guys.
I think we have another 20
So we want to make sure we have time to talk.
So one of the questions I have is, has there been any efforts for community-driven kind of data collection? So you're talking about.
Do you want to get to that?
Yeah, I didn't get to that. I'm sorry.
No, we're good.
One thing I should thank you for that. So part of what we're trying to do in Bladensburg with the Port Towns is really do citizen science. So we started. We have a student, Rosemary, who's one of our master students, who's working. And also some of our interns who've been working on using a real-time sensors to measure particulate matter and also volatile organic compounds right around the Ernest Meyer, which really, for those of you who are old enough, when I talk to young folks, I remember this, it's like Fred Sanford.
Yeah.
Fred Sanford's a junkyard. That's what it is. That's what we're talking about. So those y'all know Fred Sanford. Okay, that's what it is. But we're monitoring around that facility, plus we're monitoring at other sites like the Confluence site to look at the variation, the gradient in PM and VOC levels around the facility compared to other locations which be more residential or maybe have less traffic. So we have a student project, and then we're training residents. We already trained a few people to use some of the low-cost sensors. The idea is they can wear these low-cost sensors. They give real-time data every second. And then you get a map of the data, and then that data could be actually used as part of the decision-making process. When we go back for the next hearing, the community have its own data. And that's a big part of what my job is, to help the community build its own database.
Have you used, are some of the people who are carrying the sensors, are any of them belonging to that church, inside that church? I'm just asking.
So we haven't trained parishioners yet, but we're gonna put a real time sensor there, so we can get 24 hours every second, so you'll know what's going on. So we're working on that right now.
So basically, that congregation is able to use their building only on Sundays for about an hour and a half the entire week.
Okay, no, I'll reach out. Well, I'm a minister, so I will.
Oh, that's great.
That's
Great.
wonderful.
Yes, so I will-
They've been very receptive.
They are very, yes.
Yeah, no, it's
Yes.
just and the reason why they have it, because all the truck traffic
Yes,
during the week,
I know.
it doesn't operate on Sunday. So all the truck traffic is too dangerous and it's too much pollution. But that's our plan. So if we put the site there, that would be a site of maximum exposure, putting it there. So that's the plan.
Right, so and this is the thing about doing this work, it's like we have to raise funds because the school's been really great, but they have limited resources. So we're really at a point now of launching, in fact, I don't even know, we don't even have anything set up, but but go to our PTA website and sign up for our Facebook. At least keep watching what we're doing. At some point, we'll have a donate button up there. But it takes a lot of resources, and so so Dr. Wilson's sensors, like we went through a first round. We had problems with that.
Hiccups.
So you need electricity. You need
Wi-Fi.
Wi-Fi. So you have to buy. So there's a lot of different.
Mobile,
It's not that much, but it's enough. I mean, that we haven't even set ourselves up to do that. So we're trying now. We've been buying stuff, and so doing the work does require a level of resources that communities have to find in order to collect this data. But our plan is we've launched a project called Know Your Port Towns, and if anybody's interested in getting involved with this work, it's going to be a lot of citizen science work. A lot of community assessment work. Please let us know.
Here's one of
And
here's a
Atmo
tube. This is the VOC sensor. So it does total VOCs, like 20 different VOCs. So it's called an Atmo tube.
And noise.
And also it also gives you temperature. This one also gives you temperature, pressure, pressure, humidity. We have another sensor called Purple Air, which is more of a stationary sensor. That's the one we put in the church. It does PM10, PM25, PM1, temperature, pressure, humidity. All real-time data. And another one called the Air Beam, which is probably the first generation. It does PM10, 2.51. It gives you noise. It also gives you temperature, pressure, humidity, all that. So so right now, Rosemary's doing a lot of the work through her project. The idea is as we build out from her project, she's created a citizen science training guide that we'll be able to train more citizens to use these sensors.
Yeah,
Okay.
and this, for us, has been an outgrowth of a lot of residents, say within Bladensburg, that got very involved with code enforcement related issues within the industrial and commercial areas because our municipality was not enforcing. Okay, so and then we were hooked up with Dr. Wilson, and it's progressing from there. So this particular application has moved us forward in really getting a more comprehensive view of how to be looking at and evaluating these different sites.
How will you do coalition building between the folks in the community that are obviously wanting this, and because you certainly want to have everyone kind of come together to maximize your community consensus. So how are you going to prevent this sort of hitting against, even with the data, you're still going to have the more socialized impact that's being part of it?
Well, that's a good question, and we've been our CDC has been neutral on this issue, our Community Development Corporation, and we've done a number of community forums. Every single one we've done has been pretty packed, and the way that we've done the forums, we've presented the data. Here's the data, you decide. The CDC isn't taking a position. And that's been really good. And we've invited the attorney from this company, has come to every one of them. And at every one of them, because I've been the moderator, I've said, hey, if I got it wrong, this is an open forum. You can say what you think. You're welcome to say if it's different than what someone is talking about. He's never once got up and said a word. So that doesn't get to, a problem that we don't know the answer to. What we hope is that we're building a larger consensus of the citizens. I mean, one of the things that really impacts is that the elections in these small towns are decided by a handful of citizens. People that are elected to these positions by sometimes 25 votes or 100 votes out of this, you know, I don't know what probably 5,000 registered voters through the 4 towns or something like that. So the thing is for us is not to worry so much about how to move them per se. How do we keep the integrity of our process, which we have been so careful about, and how do we present the correct information to the community, and how do we give the community an opportunity to get involved and decide? And so far that's worked really, really well. So, yeah.
Just sort of building on that point, I mean, the citizen science is so crucial to add data, as you said, Dr. Wilson, when there is none and none has been required. I was just curious if you could talk a little bit more about, so that the data is one piece, but then this kind of quasi-legal, quasi-political process of getting a special exception, which as you were saying, can be bureaucratic and opaque. Can you just talk a little more about the process of empowering people to engage in it, understand it and engage in it?
Wow. Yeah. It's complicated. It is complicated, and so I think for me, moving to the Waynesburg area, this process started in 2014 for me, in gathering information. You know, I am very big on public access, public information, public access, whatever we can get so that people can make their decisions. One of the things that the Citizens Action Committee of Waynesburg started was a public archive of documents. Okay, and through that process, we've made that available to anyone, and have sent out notices when these types of legal milestones happen. Okay, when community meetings happen and we have new data, because as we found in this process with the special exception, there were many due process violations that happened where the public was not notified of hearings that were to take place, persons of record. So I would just say that things that you all should be considering is having, you know, a group archive of information that you collect, and become engaged early in an application process if you don't, and engage with the planning department. If you don't understand things, ask them. Engage with other communities to ask information about what does this mean, what's going to happen.
So I think just to get to sort of, I think, say a little bit more about your question is, I think we've provided, there's been sort of a core group we created a coalition group that's not a formal organization, just a loose coalition group. There's been some of us who have sort of levels of expertise on organizing and have done some of the more deep dive into some of the legal issues, but we've provided opportunities as we went for engagement depending on the players at different places. So that we inform the community, hey, we're having a hearing, we need you to turn out. And some leadership has bubbled up from these different things. Several of our delegates at the state level and our state senator showed up at the hearing, which is a very small scale kind of activity. So Victor Ramirez and Jimmy Tarbo and Diana Fennell showed up at the hearings, were given a really hard time by the judge there. I think became much more aware of the problems of the zoning process during that. So they became sort of more politicized in that process of what was happening with development and zoning in the county. Subsequently, one of them actually, thank you, wrote a bill that had to do with due process in terms of people being notified of these things. So things are beginning, and this is the thing, it's like engaging people at different levels. So we have different community people engage more. There's a couple other players that have been very active, doing more of the actually grassroots, sending out stuff. We have a web page, we have a Facebook page, we do all these communications. And it's, there's a core group who are sort of focused and concentrated, and then we keep bringing new people in. And we're constantly asking ourselves, how does this formation need to look? How can we grow this? What's the next level of engagement? In the back, yeah.
So how is the water quality? How is the water quality?
Water quality.
the water quality.
Dr. Wilson, you want to?
Yeah, so,
Try
you
that
know,
one?
part of the issue with this facility and the reason why, you know, it's important for us to address issues related to the facility is the fact that Anacostia is contaminated. So we have issues with nutrients in Anacostia. We also have issue with, you know, some of the more legacy pollution in Anacostia. Of course, Anacostia, because of stormwater runoff, is impacted by sediment, silt, pesticides. And so this facility and other industrial activities in the area impact Anacostia. Okay, commuter traffic impacts Anacostia. University of Maryland impacts Anacostia. So, you know, there is some effort, and there's been some discussion about there would be some benefits. I'm just going to say, you know, this point about the bank. There would be some benefits of this facility being upgraded so it can do a better job with stormwater management. They have done no stormwater management. As you saw from the Moss Run,
Nothing.
you have stuff, dust coming, you have dust and trash, sediments, that because of this facility, that runs into the Anacostia. And so it has a major impact on Anacostia. It also has, but again, there's a lot of pollution sources. So that's why we use the term cumulative impacts. There are multiple pollution sources, both stationary and mobile, that impact the Anacostia. So when they mention the fact you have children, high schoolers rowing, there's a whole issue about really risk, and I don't want to get into the details of it, but I don't know the whole risk management when it comes to that rowing and the impacts on those kids. So I think there's much more needs to be done. My focus is more on the air side, but of course what goes in the air, what goes up, you know, must come down. So through dry or wet deposition. So it's something that's a concern, and I know it's something that's a community concern, and that's part of the reason why I made the point earlier about there's been no site assessment. So if you expand this facility, those materials that accumulated since the 1920s can potentially, even more stuff can be disturbed and released to impact. So we talked about maybe asbestos could be on site.
Right.
So we have no idea what's on that site. And that's a major concern for the Anacostia. Go ahead.
Right. So I was just gonna tell you guys that the Port Town CDC and Chris and I worked on this really intensively. Was we created a stormwater master plan. So we just decided the community needed a master plan, and to really get serious about this, nobody was doing it. So we got a small grant, and we brought in some other nonprofits and people. We created a plan, and we mapped out get this, the storm drains in those towns. Edmondson had just done theirs. They weren't mapped. Nobody knew where the storm drains were. The county didn't know. They couldn't repair them. And there's a historic flooding in these. So tell me that, you know, talk about, you know, just structural infrastructure racism. I mean, the sense of, you know, that these communities don't even know where their own drains are, and the drains are filled with silt and debris.
And this is what Chesapeake Bay stormwater management was supposed to be, in a sense, doing as it relates.
Yes.
And if we go along with the historical history of Prince George's County, of the migrant workers who lived here, and then how the state and other counties treated this, the only difference now is it is the people of color, but when it looked like you, they still did the same thing with the MDE and all of that. But we won't go into that, but I do know Diane Fennell and all of them, and I have been pushing data to them.
Good.
And one of the things that I have done, because I told them, and Victor, who's supposed to be over this as it relates to the commission, is that if you're not coming to meetings and if you don't know what's going on in your particular community,
Right.
then your community needs to think about you when they vote. Because it's all about this particular county being overlooked because of the color that's here and the other people who are coming. So we can leave it at that.
That's right. Yeah. I don't know though.
Go ahead, Devin.
Yeah.
Somebody was.
Yeah.
So are there any efforts by the county or the state to close the loopholes you guys have now identified within the zoning approval process, planning process?
So when we were at the zoning board, the 5 minutes, when we're at the council hearing to review the appeal, there was at the last 5 to 10 minutes, there's a really interesting discussion because they were shocked when the statement was brought up that we comply. The lawyer said we comply with the law. The law sucks. The point he was making, we comply with the law. The law sucks. So they were shocked at the fact that they did not have to get a permit. They have not done any monitoring. So the lawyer kept going on those points, and he actually opened himself up more for more debate and discussion from the council. So I think part of, y'all can speak for yourselves, but I think part of what we need to do as collaborators, partners, we are going to have to work with our political folks, particularly ones who we want to vote in, get rid of some people, to make sure they change these loopholes. Because remember, this patterning which is what's happening in Blacksburg, is happening in Brandywine, it's happening
Yes.
Sheriff Road,
Yes.
it's happening throughout the county. It's happening throughout the county. Okay, so
But I will
yeah,
say,
yeah.
so the other piece is that apparently the county is redoing its zoning processes. Yes, so the problem is though for us, is that the struggle that we're in already and the other stuff that we're working on in our community, as you can tell, is just really onerous. And there is a need for a citizen-based kind of oversight on development and zoning in the county. And there's been some behind the doors talking about, can somebody start this? There is a need for this because it does affect every single one of our communities, these decisions.
But it's
So,
being done because when I went to, there was a discussion at the Environmental Justice Annual Conference, and it was about the color of law, and I got a copy
Oh,
of
yeah.
that. And so a lot of people in these communities now have purchased this book, and this May 14 hearing as relates to zoning, what they're about to do.
yes.
I think it would be very interesting, because first of all, you have to educate people to understand that laws were created against you. And so talking to
Yeah,
them,
that's
but giving
right.
them credible evidence, and these are intellectual people, these are people who make money, but also people who, in a sense, have family members who may be considered impoverished. So therefore, they are looking at them too. So I think that there is a movement. As I say, people have to trust you in order to work with you. And so there is always outlayers who will do that themselves. Just because you look like us does not really mean that you understand our issues. So we have to
Well,
work within our own.
Doesn't mean you're
I'm just
for,
saying.
with us or for
Yes,
us.
so I'm just saying that there are people who are now looking, and I think that presentation as it related to what's happening in California, and then people have already purchased it and having conversations, and churches, because you really need to know what has been instituted against you.
Yes, agreed. Stan?
Yeah, what are the critical points right now that need to be addressed, particularly what politicians that are getting up for the re-election? I'm from the Sierra Club, and we endorse candidates, and
Yep.
we can be putting pressure on these candidates to do things, and sometimes we don't know a lot of things that are happening.
Yep.
So I would like to know particularly what politicians are important at this point, and secondly, are you're before the hearing examiner now in your process? And once the hearing examiner makes his decision, where does that go then?
So the process, it's a lot of stuff, but it actually has been to the hearing
We're going
examiner.
back to there.
The hearing examiner has sent it to, our county council in Prince George's County sits as several other bodies. It sits as a county council,
The
it sits
health board,
as the Board of Health,
Board of Health,
and it also sits for
the
appeals
appeals board.
for zoning matters, and that's called the district. So how does this group of people do all this, right? So it went back, the zoning hearing examiner approved it with conditions originally after our 3-day presentation, 24 hours of hearing actually, and it went then to the district council. They, after some months of appeal and so forth, they've sent it back, which is called remand, they've sent it back to the zoning to take more evidence. So that's where we are right now. It will go back to the district council again, because it's likely there'll be another appeal on our part. So it's very timed, this will take months and months and months likely of, the back and forth and scheduling and notification and so forth. So, and the Sierra Club, I think it's your Prince George's person, who's that?
Martha Ainsworth?
Yeah, Martha, and I talked to her about this, some.
Are they doing anything?
I'm not, I don't know what they're doing.
No.
Yeah,
So,
No.
that could be a,
That's
No.
a different,
Okay.
that's probably a different
No,
conversation.
I mean, that's a different conversation.
okay.
These people who, in a sense, are part of these organizations, I understand, and I want to say this. I understand that your mother or your father may have owned a house in Prince George's County, and that you have maybe been a part of Sierra Club or whatever back in the 1950s or whatever, but you don't represent the people here. So therefore, your organization, even though it is reputable, it does not represent Prince George's County. I mean, that's all I'm saying.
But it still can help.
But I mean,
I know we're supposed to
having
stop.
a desire
Okay.
to help.
Let me
is
take,
another thing.
this person is, raise their hand, let me
I'm
just take
sorry.
one short comment from
Yeah, go ahead.
this person.
So I know that this is like an overwhelming amount of work, and you guys are doing such amazing work. Has there been any? So I work on urban forestry stuff, and
Great.
of course trees
Trees are
remove
magic.
particulate matter
Yes.
from the environment and the air, and clean water and all of those things. Has the community gotten to a place where you have priorities for green infrastructure, or obviously it really helps to have a baseline of data, and I know you're working hard to like create
Not
that,
from the
so.
municipalities.
Yeah, so that's a great way to end, because we're both now doing sort of, we know the criticalness of the work that, like Dr. Wilson, the students can help us do in the community as citizens, but the other piece is developing solutions-based approaches. Yes, and so we are very focused on developing, and we didn't have time to really go into this in the session, but the Seco district model, and we've been talking about it, we've actually officially launched it. So it's the idea of creating ways to engage, to create the aspiration of what we want, that we want, the goal is a livable community. The goal isn't to fight with people about, what they're not doing right or what their interests are. But that's part of how you get there, is you gotta look at the problems and have data. The other piece is you have to have a vision for what you do want. And we're trying to do both at the same time, because the work we're doing is really hard, but it needs to yield something fruitful and positive. So those two things are happening simultaneously.
And Nancy can provide a little bit more feedback on. She can provide a little bit more feedback on that at the end.
Yeah, I
at
can.
the closing panel. So Nancy's going to be on the closing panel. So.
If anybody wants more information about the organization, if you want to. Oh, right. I also just have a pad. You can go to PTEA, join PTEA, or is that the Facebook page, Chris?
It's joinptea.org is our website. And it's at Join PTEA on Facebook.
Okay.
And I have a sign.
Thank you, everybody. Here's some cards.